I think 2020 is the year that I finally need to see Douglas Lima, the Bellator Welterweight Champion, make the jump that we've wanted for so long into the UFC. Because I'll be honest with you guys, now's the best time. He's just beaten Rory McDonald in a rematch. Rory McDonald's moving over to PFL, so the trilogy fight, although Rory says is still a possibility, is most likely not going to happen. Douglas Lima, what else is there left for you at Bellator? You've beat Korshkov twice. Okay, like, what is there for him to do? He's already beat MVP. The biggest fight in Bellator for Douglas Lima right now would be a rematch with MVP, a guy who is already KO'd in the second round. I need to see him jump to the UFC. I really do. Like, I feel like in terms of if he wants to find out if he's the best in the world, the only upgrade for him, now that he's the Bellator Welterweight Champion, would be to move to the UFC. And I know that for some reason the UFC is going to give him a downgrade on pay, which I don't think they should do, because honestly, I feel like if they paid him $250,000 to fight, it would be worth it, because it would be a new blood in the UFC, a Bellator Welterweight Champion. Everyone would be tuning in. Think how much hype Ben Askren brought to his debut. If Douglas Lima brings half of that, he's worth $250,000. Okay? I know why the UFC would never do it. I know why the UFC has been regretting doing it for so long. And it's because that they want to show they don't want the Bellator guy to come along. Maybe, let's say Douglas Lima wins a couple fights, takes the belt all of a sudden. Maybe the UFC isn't the best promotion in the world. I know that that's why the UFC aren't doing this. Because in other promotions, the crossover fights work. But when you're the UFC and you're supposed to be the best promotion in the world, and you have that reputation, the crossover fights don't work for them. Because they have everything to lose and nothing to gain. If Douglas Lima comes over and gets beaten straight away by a top 5 guy, they'll go, oh, look, well, it's as we thought. But if Douglas Lima comes along and wins, and actually does pretty well, which is quite unlikely, but also it can happen. We've seen crazier things happen in MMA. Douglas Lima could very easily become UFC World Champion in some alternate reality down the line. All of a sudden, the UFC is not the best promotion in the world anymore. And that's worrying for them. I know it's worrying for them. But you are batshit crazy. If you're telling me that you wouldn't pick Douglas Lima to beat Rafael Dos Anjos. Because I would. Douglas Lima versus Leon Edwards. I don't know. That's how close it is. That's how close it is. I don't know who I'd pick for Leon Edwards, Douglas Lima. I think that'd be a very close fight. A really close fight. Douglas Lima versus Tyron Woodley? I don't know. Let's see it happen. I think the only problems that would be given to him would be Covington and Usman because of the offensive wrestling. But against some of these other guys that keep it standing and don't necessarily use their grappling as much as maybe they could do, Douglas Lima on the feet has a chance against the best in the world. Rafael Dos Anjos, I think he'd be a favourite. Leon Edwards, I think he'd be a slight underdog. Tyron Woodley, I think he'd be a slight underdog. But I don't think it'd be an outclassing. I need to see Douglas Lima in the UFC in 2020. Because right now, with Usman still as champ, after Usman versus Masvidal, which might be the next fight that they're going to make, what next is there in the UFC? If Woodley beats Edwards, are we long anticipating a Woodley versus Kamaru Usman rematch? Not really. Are we long anticipating a Leon Edwards versus Kamaru Usman rematch? Not really. If fucking Douglas Lima can come in here and annihilate one of these top 5 guys and insert himself into the mix, I'm game as fuck. He's a Brazilian. You could tie in some fight between him and Colby Covington based on the fact that he's Brazilian. And that sells because Covington, of course, has made a fool of Brazil since he's been on the scene. I think you're crazy if you think that Douglas Lima wouldn't be able to hang in the top 10 of the UFC. I reckon he'd smash Nate Diaz to bits. And it sucks that no one will ever get to see that. But I reckon, honestly, he would smash Nate Diaz to bits. Him versus fucking Jorge Masvidal. I mean, you can get creative with some of the fights that you can make. He's a big welterweight. He can go maybe up to middleweight at some point as well. But Douglas Lima right now, I mean, I can see why he would want to say at Bellator. Because I'm sure he's earning a pretty penny over there. I mean, he just made $1 million off of the welterweight Grand Prix. I'm sure he's going to be making about $250,000 every single time he fights. I doubt that the UFC would pay him that if he came over from Bellator. I think at best he would get $100,000 to show, $100,000 to win. But I say to UFC, listen, give him a free fight contract. If he loses 2 of them in a row, get rid of him. Pay him $250,000 each fight. I say it's a worthwhile investment. Look at the hype Ben Askren brought to the UFC. Let's bring over a real current Bellator champion. Because remember, before Ben Askren came to the UFC, he was kind of sidelined for a bit. He was out of the spotlight for a bit. You know? Douglas Lima, fresh off a win with Rory McDonald too. The best thing he can have at Bellator would be an MVP rematch against a guy who he's already beaten. There's no hype left in Bellator for him. I think he needs to vacate the belt, let MVP become king of the can crushers, and then Douglas Lima needs to maybe go to the UFC, because I tell you this, if Douglas Lima's in the UFC and MVP becomes Bellator Welterweight Champion, which could happen with Douglas Lima out of the mix, I could see MVP coming to the UFC just for a Douglas Lima rematch. I need to see it, man. There's so many guys at Bellator, like Michael Chandler, that Patricio Pitbull. There's a bunch of guys over at Bellator, Ryan Bader, that you would maybe say, they could stand a chance against some of the top 10 guys in the divisions right now. But with Douglas Lima, I really think he could beat Dos Anjos. I think he has a very good chance of beating Leon Edwards. He's the one guy, if I were to name a bunch of people right now, and I think we're all in synchronization with this, that I think could really make a run for the title in the UFC. Dangerous man. No one's talking about him. I need to see him in the UFC in 2020. Let's make it happen. Any way you can. Like and subscribe. And listen, if he comes over and gets KO'd, whoever beats him is a superstar. That's what Ben Askren did, you know? And I know Douglas Lima doesn't talk the same level of shit, but he has that esteem to him. You know, a dominant champion coming into the UFC. And even if they don't want to give him straight to Rafael Dos Anjos, listen. Robbie Lawler's lingering around. There's a bunch of guys in this division. I'm sure if you ask Gilbert Burns if he wants to take on Douglas Lima in a debut, he'd happily say yes. I love it. Like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Douglas Lima 2020. Click that button there. Goodbye. Goodbye.